NGO as a teenager. This vocational exposure in transformation space includes management roles in mining sector, media sector, and pharmaceutical sector. His thoughts can be read from News 24, SAFM, and Power FM podcasts. If you may stand, Mr. Litheko, so the audience can see. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the discussion from our esteemed panel. That was the last panel member I was going to introduce. Over to you, Mr. Mahomed.
Thanks, Zanele. My first job was at Volkswagen, and I was a production clerk, which essentially was a mail boy. So I had to go and do the post office thing to see how mail was delivered properly. Anyways, let's do the presentations. I'm going to try and go through them fairly quickly, and really it's going to be an information overload, if you like. But we're going to try and do this as quick as possible and then start opening up the floor. So, really, this is a study that, as our CEO has said, which was done in 2019, and COVID visited all of us. So I hope it didn't give you any trouble. But we sort of left it a bit, and COVID sort of switched off the industry for about 2 years. But he said essentially this study goes across all the aspects of the automotive sector. Sort of talks to localization, talks to transformation, but we're going to focus on transformation only. So there's your automotive master plan. You all know this. I am not going to spend a lot of time in here. However, I am making these sort of linkages here in terms of localization and transformation. I think the two goes hand in hand. They work together. You cannot only take transformation. You don't want to take the entire organized industry and transform it. You need to use another mechanism to help transformation. So that's the real interest that I have between these two slides in terms of localization and transformation. This is not really everything that we're looking for, but I think as a thought starter, what is this roundtable going to look at? Are we looking to sort of who are the key players that can unlock this transformation? What are the measures to remove localization constraints, if there are any? And I'm sure there are. And then a platform for black suppliers. I think there's a lot of mechanism that needs to be put in place. You will see through the presentation. Now, these were just thought starters with ECSECC and ourselves when we said, what do we want? What is the outcome of this sort of roundtable? And there's much more. Please, it's your roundtable. Engage with us. This is our profile, and I think this holds true for the entire country. But essentially, this is the Eastern Cape. Now, this is the big problem that we've got. That 62% of the industry is above level 4. Now, what do you do about this? Do you just change the industry? There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of transformation. But you can see, and I think most of the other, let me go back. Most of the other panelists will be talking about very much the same as we've got it here. The next slide is a very important slide, which really talks to locally owned companies and multinationals. You can see that locally owned transformation is sort of a lot better, but in terms of your multinationals, you have a big problem. Ownership remains the biggest problem. It's foreign-owned companies inside South Africa. Now, let me say the industry is as long as 100 years, as old as 100. This country would not be as great as it is if it wasn't for the multinationals that are, we rank amongst the best in the world as far as technology is concerned, as far as making cars. South Africa makes quality cars. We export them across 151 destinations. So it's an export-driven, and that's really all with these multinationals that are in our automotive sector. This is the study that reveals on tier ones. Now, essentially, 75% of Nacaam's directory list is that of multinationals. So here are and I'm not really, this is the scorecard. It's really just taking all these sort of family-owned businesses that you've got. You've got multinationals. You've got change of ownership and structure. So you look at all the series codes, and those are the ones that you need to work on. So in terms of digging deeper down, here are the different subsectors that we've got, and I've told you that I've worked for most of those people, so I pretty much understand the sort of, and that's the level of sort of compliance one has in all the different subsectors. But you can also see in terms of skill, in terms of skills and social, you can see that the industry, including multinationals, has done pretty much around skills and CSI, but management control is sort of picking up at the moment, but ownership still remains a big sort of issue. If I go to tier 2s and 3s, a very different picture, right? So the smaller suppliers have less of a problem with transformation. It is more with your tier 1s than it is with your tier 2s and 3s. Now, to the room that doesn't understand tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, so a tier 1 is somebody that supplies directly to an OEM, a tier 2 will supply to a tier 1, a tier 3 will supply to a tier 2. So that's the sort of hierarchy of how suppliers support each other. And generally your tier 2s and 3s are the smaller sort of suppliers. They're also fairly large. South Africa has a particular big problem in such that tier 1s and 2s, we have 70% of our suppliers that are concentrated in tier 1, tier 2. Our base is very weak. If you match us against a Thailand, a Morocco, all kinds of other sort of countries that are in the sort of automotive space, they're relatively the same size as us. They're much bigger in the bottom, right? So this is where we need to work on with the smaller. This is why my first slide said localization and transformation. You need to link the two. And that's where you're going to build your tier 3s and your tier 4s. Well, let's not talk about beneficiation. That's probably a subject for another day. But that's where you're really going to build manufacturing capacity in the country. In terms of, and I'm just going to summarize again. I've gone through it before, but essentially, this is your problem. Ownership remains ownership remains a big problem, right? You've got family-owned enterprises, you've got tier 1s and OEMs, and yes, this was 2019 where we've done the study. AITF has subsequently come on board, so that's addressed some of, but it doesn't essentially tier. You know that Isuzu is a level 1 supplier, Mercedes-Benz is level 2, but I'm not going to steal Tshetlhe, and I said I'm going to trip my tongue. I'm not going to steal his thunder. He's going to be talking to that. So again, just to sort of re-emphasize skills and CSI, which I'm cutting off in the bottom here, those are things that the industry has really worked on hard. And you can see there is a will from the industry to transform, right? And that's a scorecard thing. I think Renai will speak later too. We want real transformation in the industry, and that's what we're looking to. Then opportunities fast track. Really, this is a lot of information to sort of digest. But essentially, you know that there's about 5.2 billion rand worth of product that can be manufactured if you go to 60% local content. So at this point in time, I keep pressing the wrong button. If we leave things as they are, so down here in terms of number of black suppliers, in terms of spend, and we know that one of the pillars of automotive master plan is to sort of go to 60% local content. So you can really see the amount of value, the amount of product that can be produced once we reach the targets. So there's very little GDP spent on small black suppliers, which is currently in that sort of quadrant. Eventually, when we do get to do the transformation as well as localization, that's the amount of money we can have with black suppliers. I'm going to quickly, we've done a study on metals, we've done a study on plastics, we've done a study on sort of injection molding, but again, metal press parts probably offers the quickest and the easiest opportunity for new suppliers to come into the space. You can see that the amount of local content imported, we only import 12%, and those are the different years that we've had, so your local content is very high. And I must say that this is across small press parts. Big press parts still remains quite a challenge in simply that it's huge investment cost. And your volumes need to really be right. and your timelines need to be right. But in terms of small press parts, certainly big opportunity. And if you look to the profile of the smaller companies, tier 2s and 3 suppliers, it's mostly into the sort of metal space. Here's the slide, and there's a lot of other information that I can share with you, but in terms of quadrants, you can really see press parts right at the top in terms of localization opportunity, up in the 4th quadrant. Interior trim, really low on deepening local content. I work for the interior trim people. In terms of headliners, you import all the material. There's very little local then. It's simply just the volume. And we're big on textiles, but you cannot produce those kind of textiles inside South Africa because the volumes just doesn't justify it. Then if you go to sort of plastics, injection molding, improve competitiveness, waste factors are still largely very, very high in terms of press parts. So, and you have got improved competitiveness, so you can't compete. I know in terms of injection molding, there's MCR is not here, but they probably be yourself AAG that's going to sort of move into that space. You get a lot of high-tech equipment today to sort of get into that space. I think in terms of injection molding, you're probably going to get the same as press parts. The smaller injection molding with small machines, small footprint, lay it down quickly and get these sort of economies of scale. Barriers. Now, we got 25% inclusiveness. Now, barriers to entry in terms of drug. I think I've repeated these sort of things, but I need to reiterate them. Limited motivation from family-owned business. And for me, really, it's localization. You cannot take family-owned business and transform them, sell them. For me, a real transformation needs to come from opportunities that we create within the industry, as opposed to buying out white-owned companies. Motivation, multinational owner, we talked about it. I mean, it's very strong. I think we need to leave our multinationals in our country. They've built our industry to where it is today. And if we continue to have them, we will continue to have the best technologies in South Africa. Lack of significant efforts in black supplier development. I think this is the forum, this is the sort of roundtable that we're sort of asking, what do we do from a government sort of point of view? How do we support industry? In terms of clear indication of who's driving transformation, yes, this is 2019. I think there's a little more clearer guidelines around who's driving transformation. But at the end of the day, it's DTIC that it should be taking the M&E, the monitoring evaluation. We should be getting it, whether it's 5-year intervals or 1-year interval. We should get a sort of track record as to are we gaining, are we losing, what is happening. In terms of challenges for procurement and supply challenges, I think you know this, and a lot of us know that cars essentially run for 7 years, 5 to 7 years. When you start getting a program, and again, Andre is going to be talking to some of those sort of things, you sort of catch the wave maybe into the 3rd year. You've only got 4 years of supply, plus what Andre will share with you shows you another set of problems that you've got. So OEM requirements are not clear. Procurement process fraught with delays, lack of information, lack of experience. Now listen, these are all studies that we got from industry, right? These are not stuff that I'm saying, okay? They're real. We need to listen to what people are saying to us, right? If you feel offended about some of these, please don't, okay? Because this is the voice of the supplier, right? I'm going to sort of just put them down here in terms of components and key factors of supporting and driving transformation. Access to technology and capital, which is what we need to talk to. Access to finance, cost and effective inputs of raw materials, skills, accreditation, procurement process, limited formalist drive. So those are all the things that you sort of know about. And I think access to finance probably remains one of the bigger problems that you've got. There's so many hidden costs that we're not even aware of. But let Andre talk to those. Then I'm just going to put this one up here. You know, I was in one black supplier day that we've had, and one of the black suppliers said to us, this OEMs and this industry of yours, why do they want us to be AITF certified or TS 16949 or QF? And I said to him, but sir, anybody can drive a car. But if the traffic stops you and you can't present a license, you're going to go to jail. So we can all drive, but this is the conscience. This is what the supplier says. You will make the product the same way every day, every minute, every hour, and you will improve. We talked about competitiveness. This will make sure that you become competitive. Okay? Now, I have done enough talking now. I'm going to give it to Andre. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to start the conversation by saying that transformation is not changing only from white to black-owned suppliers, but it's also changing the perception and how we work as black-owned suppliers. And I speak from a position of how we move through this journey as Acoustex to where we find ourselves today. Because, you know, we thought we into the market now, we need to ride this wave of BEE, but if you are not equipped as a supplier, you're going to fail drastically. So drastically, we took over in 2007 from a previous company, white-owned company, Formex, well-established in the market. We thought, yes, BEE, the wave, we're going to ride it. 2015, we nearly shut our doors because we bit too much what we could chew, and we didn't understand the jargon, the requirements of the automotive industry before we jumped head-on into that. So I just want to start the conversation like that. I think my business partner, if he was here, he would have been very happy to see localization supermarket because he's a Greek, and they want to localize everything. You know, if there's this, they want to jump into it and take it without understanding the consequence of what there is going into the future. So I just want to start this slide. You will see, is it there? Yes, who's that guy?
I was driving fairly well until you got here.
Yeah, I see.
My presentation.
Yeah.
The last slide on my presentation. Go back to number 1.
I'm happy if you do mine while you're at it.
No. I don't think I'll do a good job and justice of that. So let me just explain the pre-bidding process. So I speak from my own context. Acoustex gets a part to quote on. Let's say it's this remote over here. The OEMs come to you without a commitment whatsoever and tell you, please quote on this product. And to get to that end goal, you need to invest so much as a supplier. You need to do feasibility studies. We just dealt with an OEM now to say that, look, they don't have this information available. Please develop the part for us. It means we must go to an outside service provider, develop CAD, computer-aided design, so that we can develop tooling from that. We then need to do various studies, FMEAs. We need to do process flows. We need to understand how this part is going to fit into our process in our factory. We need to get machine. You get my thinking. So much work is happening during this pre-bidding phase from months 3 to 8 before we even have a commitment. All during this time, we are paying people in our plant quite a significant amount of money because these are experts in order to get this product for something we haven't actually got in our pocket just yet. We are at risk, no one else. Okay? From that phase, as we continue, we then submit the RFQ to the customers. They receive it. They are happy with it. They give us a letter of intent. And this is where we failed before. During the bidding process, you already as a supplier need to come up with your business plan. Because if you don't have that, you're in trouble. Because what we do is we celebrate, yes, we've got this letter of intent. The party goes on for a month. Time is ticking. And we know with funding instruments, it usually takes 3 to 6 months in order for us to access that funding. And that only applies when your funding model is 100% correct. Because they will come back to you and say, guys, but this doesn't make sense here. It delays the process even further. And with our OEMs, they call it, they like to sign the timeline in blood. If you miss a deadline, they penalize you for localization fees. So if you haven't got that up front, it puts you in danger. And that's what happens in the awarding of the business. And you'll see my last business, or my last bullet point that says, secure investment funding lines with project timelines. So I want to tell you this, we are not a multinational. We don't have shareholders that can put millions of rands up front into the project and pay for the machines up front. We're reliant on banks, government instruments. it just isn't that way. I worked at a company, it was Red, and I must thank our marketing team. That bio was quite impressive, I must say. At Federal Mogul, we had international US company. We filled out a CapEx requisition form. We would need this machine, that machine. The OEM tooling would cost, let's say, 10 million rand, and usually the OEMs would pay you a deposit. A company like that would say, no, thank you, we'll fund it out of our own pockets, and then at the end of that, we'll just charge you the interest so they could make money on that. As a black supplier, you can't do that. For every new product that you put into your facility, you need to invest, which means you only really see the returns on that equipment in the next model, whereas multinationals are using old equipment to maximize the value of the business that they have. And that's the difference between the disparity between the two. Then we move on to the next phase, where we implement the machinery in the facility, and we need to commission it. We need to get approvals on it. The biggest issue with South Africa is that a lot of our test labs are not within South Africa. They are outside South Africa. So we bring the machines from outside. We bring a lot of the raw materials from outside of the country. We produce the part here. We send it back overseas to get tested. We bring it back, and then only can we supply the customer. It's a difficult situation to be in, to be a South African supplier. Whereas you find a multinational, they do that all within their scope. So in this timeline there, you can see from month 3 to month 24, we've got this development cost that's going all the time. And this development cost is an intangible cost. It's my cost, it's the MD's cost, it's the technical team's cost. The bank is just rolling it the whole time as we're incurring these funding. And the problem with the funders that we have is no one is willing to fund this because it's not a tangible asset. You can't put security against it, yet you're incurring this cost. And what a lot of black suppliers also forget, and that's what our problem was, our biggest focus was focusing on the investment instead of focusing on the working capital. And as you can see there, from month 3 to month 24, you're spending all this money, but you actually haven't made any turnover or cash flow. You're out of pocket 2 years prior to the event already. And that's where I bring this topic up. We must become more savvy. I think our funders and government can also support us in this way to understand how instruments can be made available to support development cost and working capital where there's no security, that we can actually become stable. Because we found that black suppliers, a lot of them has been awarded contracts in the first phase, but they don't make it to month 24 because they haven't catered for those specific funding needs. And then the last focus there is post-investment, and this is a critical one. And what we found is that we must be so, how can I say, conservative in our approach. Because the OEMs will tell you, please localize this part. It's at 100,000 units per annum, but when you actually come to doing the work, it's only at 50,000. The banks don't show mercy. There's no variable volume implication for it if you don't make it. So this is just a synopsis of what we've learned as a supplier. And I think it's critical that us as black suppliers, we sit back, we have discussions, we understand what our needs are. Our needs are not the same as the multinationals. It's very different. And then also breaking that perception, which there is in the market at times, that black-owned suppliers can only do the small parts, the low-risk parts, and understanding where we want to fit in the market. Is it at tier 1 or is it at tier 2 and 3? Thank you so much.
Renai, I'm only going to announce you're not doing a presentation. So you don't need any formal introduction again. So Renai, please.
Morning, and thanks to, I suppose, AIDC Eastern Cape in the main, but the rest of the organizing team as well, for having Nacaam and myself being part of this discussion. I think the topic is one that I think as South Africans, as even here in the Eastern Cape, I've been coming down for a number of years, and this topic has been one that we've had a lot of, in government there's a term, robust engagements Andre, I want to say thank you. Where is he? He's here. I thought you went that way. For me, that was probably the most enlightening short presentation on some of the kind of real and practical factors of trying to work within what is probably the most competitive global value chain that we've got here in South Africa. Having said that, and as much as it's hard work, I think I can very honestly say that our ability as a sector to crack this code on, I don't even want to say black supplier development, but let's say black supplier participation in the auto sector in South Africa. We've got to crack the code, and we've got to do it in a way, like Hoosain was saying, it's not trying to cut or share the same pie. It's about growing that pie and having more value-adding participants in the sector, as opposed to trying to buy out or have a reclassification of ownership. I suppose those are kind of my introductory thoughts, having heard some of the earlier presentations. There's many in the room who I already know. For the rest, Nacaam is an organization that represents the interests of automotive component manufacturers in the country. We've got a very wide base of membership across all of the key industrial hubs supporting vehicle assembly in the country. And the Eastern Cape is obviously one of our large areas with representation both in East London and here in PE. I've got a presentation that in some way will probably talk to some of the statistics and snapshots that Hoosain presented, Mr. Mahomed. Allow me to maybe just give some confidence to the participants here today that I do think the information that you presented, as you explained, is a bit dated. I do think there has been some improvements. Unfortunately, BEE, as we know it in South Africa, has typically been a scorecard-driven exercise. And response, and as much as we all like to have lunch and dinner time discussions, this is a business environment. People respond to compliance requirements for component manufacturers in terms of qualification for the incentive packages offered by government. There's a time frame involved, and component manufacturers need to be level 6 by the end of this year and level 4 by the end of next year. In all likelihood, what we should find ourselves in is, come Q1 next year, lots of those who need to implement certain initiatives to hit their compliance requirements should be getting there. But in essence, what I'm probably going to show today is not in any way different from kind of what you spoke about. We do an annual sort of BEE or transformation survey across our membership base. As of, I think this is fairly fresh, it's a few months ago.
June 2022.
Yeah, just under 50% of our respondents achieve level 4 or better on their 22-23 scorecard. Just under 40% falling outside of the APDP level 6 requirement. I think you mentioned it, in terms of our sample, multinational entities formed a slight majority. Over the past year, more than 20% of our companies have seen an improvement in the BEE level. The majority maintain a constant BEE level, and 13% deteriorated. Again, that deterioration is probably a reflection of some of the tough economic conditions faced because of macro challenges, supply chain issues, and flooding, and sometimes the scorecard is one where it's easier to move back on, especially if there wasn't a compelling requirement for this year. It's easy to get stuck in statistics, and it's also easy to default to a view that things cannot be done. My own organization, several years ago, adopted a mandate that says we've channeled as much information to the authorities as possible. We've highlighted all of the challenges. Hoosain, you can tell a story some other time about my view on that word challenges, but we've highlighted for a long time the difficulties of existing companies to meet some of the transformation topics. And I think that's happened like maybe from around 2010 or something. By 2016, it was very clear to anyone who was involved in any discussion at government level that this was not going anywhere. So Nacaam took a conscious decision to say, all right, okay, if it's not going anywhere, how do we support our membership? How do we ensure that the component manufacturing fraternity in South Africa finds ways to get to the requisite levels of participation in terms of transformation? So the purpose of today is not really to go through all of these mechanisms. There's a whole really big advisory community out there, including some who are Nacaam associate members. There's a lot of support out there for various parts of the scorecard. I heard some clapping for the OEMs. By the way, Nacaam is a level 1. Yeah, thank you. But anyway, what I was saying is, in terms of the mindset of how to approach transformation, it was one that said, listen, this is not going anywhere. Let's just try and find the most commercially feasible way of supporting the base to get to where they need to go. Interestingly, that transition timing, we lobbied very hard with the DTIC to get that in place for the component manufacturers. At one point, they were pushing hard to get us over the line January 2021 for the whole sector to be level 4, and we said, listen, in the supplier base, that's not going to happen. We need to be reasonable about how this is implemented. We're supporting companies to get across the line, but we also need the timing to support that. So yeah, across all of the major elements in terms of scorecard priority areas, we've got a range of supporting, I suppose, programs in place, but that doesn't mean that there's no other options. I think the ownership one is the one that's most spoken about. For the manufacturing companies within our space, we assist them in terms of the identification of joint venture or empowerment partners. We provide support for Statement 102 sale of asset, which is but one of the ways companies can engage with the ownership requirement. And very important, you guys have seen it across both presentations, we are actually in the process of taking a batch of multinational tier 1s into the Autos Industry Transformation Fund. Hoosain, again, I think your timing of the 2019 report was probably around the period where the AITF was almost going through its gestation setup space. I want to make a few statements about the AITF. Been watching its story and been part of its story for some time. As industry stakeholders, probably around 2017, 2018, naamsa and Nacaam were part of discussions on how to deal with this issue of ownership, and led by the 7 OEMs, agreed on setting up what was the first sort of industry consolidated equity equivalent. Now, anyone can do an equity equivalent. I'm sure if there's multinationals in the room, they've investigated it. The idea from the sector was, let's do something that talks directly to the objectives of the SA Autos Master Plan. Let's do something that's commercially feasible, and let's do something that we can present as a sector. So the 7 OEMs really drove this, and I'm sure my colleague from NAMSA is going to explain a bit more. So they were central to setting up this fund. As component manufacturers, we said, it doesn't make any sense for us to now go and do something different. The moment this institution is set up and it's working, we will then take the multinational members within our space who want to use this through the same structures. And right now we're in the middle of getting, it's a regulatory process, and we're in the middle of getting that done for the multinationals. Me personally, I see this structure as one of the most innovative industrial policy levers in South Africa. We've had APDP for a long time. There's a whole host of incentives, and this is the only one. It comes at a really attractive price point if you want to talk about buying or paying for the different elements of the scorecard. So in terms of ownership, the cost of participating for a multinational here is fairly attractive. The one positive from what Hoosain was saying earlier, there's an element of guaranteed or forced, not forced, but confirmed offtake for black-owned suppliers. And I haven't seen any other mechanism like that in any other sector, or even in our sector anywhere else. So the AITF has the backing of industry as something that's going to positively contribute to transformation. And I think you were talking about where's the focal point or who's driving or whatever that may be. I think this is an organization or institution that will be playing a stronger role going forward. I recognize some of what you were saying, Andre, and I don't think those financing or funding issues are not unknown. I feel as if these are the kind of structures that may have the ability to answer and provide that kind of innovative solution as they find their feet as well. So, yeah. Again, I don't think I need to spend too much of time on this. We've got a whole host of supporting mechanisms for our membership. And those of you in the room who've interacted with the team at Nacaam, I'm sure you would have been part of some fairly innovative or different type of discussions on how to unlock localization business cases. I know you've worked with the team quite a lot, and sometimes in this particular environment, those of us who've been in this, where they have this discussion of low-hanging fruit and industry participation, and there's no low-hanging fruit. I don't buy the terminology. I don't like using it. Is it anywhere here? Yeah, it was there. But I keep on telling my team, that thing doesn't exist. There's no low-hanging fruit. Having said that, what we do have is an environment where you've got a fairly complex supplier base with 7, let's use the 7 domestic OEMs having their own sets of requirements and specifications, and your trim example is a really good one. In the industry purchasing space, that headliners one has been examined from, I think, I don't know, maybe 15 years now, and still hasn't come because of the different specs on the raw material. But it was highlighted as low-hanging fruit when I was at the DTI in 2010. What I was going to get to is that often it's about having a partner who wants to think differently, join certain dots that you're not going to find in a recipe book somewhere, and approach localization from a perspective that says, how do we make it work, not necessarily showing me all the reasons why it can't work. We also have, I think, facilitation guidance over a structure called the Auto Supply Chain Competitiveness Initiative, which comes with a bit of state funding for a range of different programs, including supporting systems for the why is AITF stuck in my head? It's the ATIF 16949. What? IH, sorry. the AITF from transformation thing was stuck there. Anyway, thanks. Including how to, the various supporting mechanisms around getting that certification. It doesn't pay for the actual certification, but a range of support services. Something that Shivani and her team have been doing quite a lot of is to try and approach this localization discussion. And I think you were right, eh? Localization and transformation in South Africa right now are synonymous. You can't separate the two. In fact, OEMs and tier ones increasingly, if you're taking localization business cases to them, if you're not framing it within a BEE lens, they're saying, hey, we're not interested. Because again, their own scorecards work in terms of their kind of preferential procurement / localization objectives. Long story short, we're looking at it from a very bottom-up approach to say, how do we kind of, instead of saying at OEM level, here's a common purchasing headline or opportunity and then trying to drill it down. What we're saying is, maybe there's a black-owned injection molder, has this particular capability. Now let's look at the tier one and possibly OEM base to see what can this capability deliver in terms of some of their own localization opportunities. This is a fairly innovative program that we've been running with a few global partners, headlined by the IYF, the International Youth Foundation, and also in partnership with the Department of Higher Education and Training, to assist and reskill in the TVET space. We've also, I suppose, got various structures for our members who want to discharge skills development spends into this area. It's not in the presentation, but one of the really, really exciting partnerships that have come through the High Gear program is the launch of something called the Yaki Future Platform, where kids are using a web-based facility to get training on, amongst others, the new EV coming component production and servicing requirements, and that's being done in partnership with the British High Commission. In terms of an EV-specific skills intervention in the component space, I think it's the first of a kind that's got that level of resource dedicated to it. So, I'm going to stop there because we can talk about supporting infrastructure for transformation in a long time. I like where, facilitator, you were going, that we would have an open discussion. Ultimately, I only stand here in support of, I think, what the expectations of the AIDC Eastern Cape, the wider government structures here in the region want, which is completely, I suppose, aligned with what we as industry stakeholders see as a really key developmental objective for the sector going forward. So let me stop there and I'll hand over to one of the colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Renai. Wow, that's a lot of information that we've had. I mean, we've got one more presentation to do, which is naamsa. You want to take a break, or do we do the naamsa now? You want to do the naamsa now? Okay. Thank you. Naamsa.
Hey, good morning. There we go. For all of you who might not be aware, my opening cover slide is promoting an event from the 24th to the 30th at Kyalami called the SA Auto Week. I would like to take this opportunity before observing protocol, CEO, to invite every one of you to Google naamsa SA Auto Week, which is going to be our inaugural event where we will take policy matters and these conversations that we're having today around supplier support into a much more global scale so that we could get the right type of legislative transformation and feedback that we could get from your role players as you identify them, whether it's government, the DTIC, or organizations such as the AIDC, and we strengthen industry partnerships with other partners like Nacaam and related industry role players. That said, let me observe protocol and say thank you for your invite, CEO, and for everyone as esteemed as you are. Acknowledge this greeting as a protocol. And Renai, I must admit that I love the ECSECC, is it ECSECC platform, the EV training platform. I love high gear as well. I mean, work readiness, as you have pitched it, I think that program is game changing. So high gear, if you don't know it, Google it. If you are in that TVET training institution, let's figure out how to go with that program, because it's got all the right elements in it. Andre, I also enjoyed your presentation, and I'll share with you as we go into this presentation some of what we are doing from an OEM point of view around how we help guys like you, especially with the feasibility funding, sort of get you into the conversations that we're having over and above the AITF conversation with the AIDCs that have got feasibility study funding in place specifically so that we could get black suppliers into this particular space. That said, there is a lot of information to process, and when you've got a presentation that's loaded with content, the temptation is that you try to speak to every slide and you miss out on what essentially should be a deliverable and what you're trying to speak to. And so what I then did is that I would try with 40 slides to say 3 things. And if after 40 slides I'm unable to say these 3 things, assume that I said them. And you can ask me questions on them after the fact. But effectively, industry is responsive to policy. And to Renai's earlier point, when policy says that there is a particular threshold that you need to meet, effectively, you become like a hammer, you hit that nail. And if the expectation is for suppliers to reach level 6 end of this particular year, the expectation is that by Q1, all efforts would go into that effort, and there should be a better than 62 Hoosain compliance at level 6, and more a better than 38. I'm assuming 38.5. That's where we'll probably be. So that's one thing that I'll be able to just even demonstrate with numbers. Then the other two is that the theory of change that the OEMs have assumed that on how do we bring about transformation in the supply chain, it might be premised wrongly on a concept called widening localization, which is how do we diversify components that we can localize and create those additional supply chains, bring in more factories, and obviously the NEV conversation says how do you do battery assembly and battery manufacturing locally, but it's that widening conversation that we're looking at, and perhaps as a theory of change is that if you widen, then the deepening activities will then filter through to building that 25% GVA that will go to tier 3, tier 2 suppliers. That's the theory of change. Now, during our roundtable, I'll be happy to discuss the merits of that and as to whether or not it's something we could correct and we could look deeper into it. And the third thing, effectively, is the balance of local value addition. And to Hoosain's earlier presentation around tier 2, tier 3, doing LVA, I mean, those levels compared to, say, where we stand as other suppliers are quite different. And so that's a conversation we need to have. That said, we always as NAMSA like to start with sharing these KPIs, precisely because without these KPIs, we don't have any industry. NAMSA is really about producing vehicles, and to an earlier slide, the amount of vehicles and production that we have in the country means that as an industry, we are all 4.2 contributors to GDP. And 2.4 of that contribution is within our production systems, which includes all the contributions we're making as component suppliers as well. So together we are adding to that 2.4, and obviously with the sales and the aftermarket, there's an additional 1.9 that's added. Now, we are now exporting our products to about 152 destinations. So the 151 was not that far off. And that domestic production of 493 peaked at around 624 in 2019. But if we look into what Sum 35 aims to achieve, which is 1% production of global production, that's about 1.1 million units that we could produce. So in that discussion of if we get these volumes and if we improve and we meet that 1% production, opportunities for widening would make sense as well, because then we would have the right volumes for certain localization activities that we currently say we're strained to actually get into. Again, feeding into that theory of change that we believe would bring that deepening of localization to 25% GVA by black suppliers. As long as that. I'm happy to say that I'm at the epicenter of car production in the country, because the Eastern Cape is the biggest region that contributes in terms of volumes. So, and I was saying earlier today that I was surprised at how many people I know in Gqeberha, albeit that the last time I was in this particular town was back in 1994 playing cricket. So I should come here much more often. So if you want to invite me for coffee, I'm available. I'll skip this particular slide. The first point that I said I'm going to make is the fact that effectively there are level of sophistications, as Renai said, and that makes this industry quite competitive in terms of what makes it practical for us to have an industry. And so the role of government cannot be understated, especially the bouquet of benefits and the bouquet of policies that we have that makes it practical for us to have an industry in the country. And so for OEMs not to appreciate that there is at a policy level a very fundamental relationship that needs to be nurtured and grown between us and government, specifically because certain things, they do get to a point where they might not make sense. I mean, for me to say I'm at the epicenter of car production in the country, and we then evaluate the type of infrastructure challenges that we might have, like, say, water availability, electricity availability, and still maintain the growth of an industry, and still aspire to double the type of production levels that we have today, so that there could be about 1.1 million. There's a lot of sort of impracticalities that might... Did I stop clicking? Oh, sorry. Or I did go 2 slides above. However, what I can demonstrate, though, is that... What I can demonstrate, though, is that every time when government had made an announcement with policy, production went up. Any time when there was the announcement of APDP, the response was production went up. Now, we talk about APDP2, which we've had now for almost a year. Production numbers have gone up, but obviously the base created by 2019 was quite huge. But that said, there's certain numbers that I can also demonstrate to you that otherwise they don't make sense. The OEMs, at a factory floor level, for instance, we've employed about 5.6 thousand new jobs in the period that APDP2 has been around, which is from last year, July. And so that policy response to industry is quite significant. But like I said, the peak that we're all working towards in our theory of change is doubling that 624 that we had in 2019. And perhaps the most unfortunate victim of COVID is that our production numbers went down because of that down period. And whether that trajectory was us acknowledging that 1.1 million was possible, we will never know. But then we've got a new opportunity with engagement to work together to get to those. Now, I did say that we are responsive to policy, and when the policy required that all our OEMs achieve level 4, we went and we achieved level 4. Your OEMs in your province are level 1, level 2, and level 3. But all of our OEMs in the country, all 7 of them, have achieved BE level 4. So they are ready for that expectation on them by the end of this particular year. But like Hoosain said, if the focus becomes enterprise development and our relationship with our suppliers, our scope there gets quite limited. And the reason why it does get quite limited is because our performance levels are fairly up. Except one OEM that's in their 20s. Against the 40, our OEMs are doing quite well. So scorecard motivation is limited into how we then employ, we get into black supply development, or we get into that space where black supply development becomes natural for us to circumvent some of the IATF type of expectations. But there is a lot of work done for that. Obviously, Renai spoke to the tool that we have that makes this possible, which is AITF. Those 25, 50, and 15s that our OEMs are scoring are still depending on how well they do. One of the other ones is obviously investing in the AITF as a fund. But the other particular deliverable that our OEMs need to have for AITF to continue giving them that scoring is something called market access, where there is a commitment to creating 100,000 black-owned entities, whether it's in the supply chain, but effectively those particular OEMs can exist across the entire value chain. And that definition of market access, how do we take that and we make it a tier one market level market access conversation, and what are the dynamics there? But because of the existence of the AITF and that scorecard pressure remaining on the table, because if you remove those numbers, these companies are standing almost close on level 5 or so, becomes a very important conversation to have. So as we go, as we evolve, and as we get into that market access conversation, and AITF begins to graduate their beneficiaries, obviously those results will shape these conversations, because then learnings would come up differently from what happens when a supplier is sponsored by AITF, different from what could be the situation at present. So that's something that we can look out for. But in the presence of scorecard pressure, one of the many other pressures, and it's twofold, is that 60% local content. Now, 60% local content is a pressure point on the industry at 2 levels. One, there's something called rules of origin, which allows us to export vehicles through free trade to certain markets. And so if you take those markets, they wouldn't allow our products if they don't have the local content. Given, obviously, even within those trade clauses, there's an aggregation, a consolidation, a measure that makes it practical for us to still export to Europe, and without getting into it. Our local content ranges between 40 to 60%, but it almost averages out at 45. And so, therefore, we can say we have an industry that's benefiting from free trade agreements, but we don't have a mature system to maintain that benefit. And so there is that pressure point that we could work on. It is this pressure point, perhaps, as well, that would create an impression that the industry is opposed to the deadline, end of the year, that's imposed on us helping, on suppliers achieving level 6. Because of this low performance around local content, if we do get to the end of the year and some of our suppliers are not ready and we lose that local value, it would therefore mean that we would sort of almost come at an impasse of some kind. And so it's something that we are as an industry, we are led to. We may have voiced it and came through as anti-transformational at some point. However, it's because of our view of the land. But that said, so that would be my second point. We respond to policy, we achieve policy, we need to widen. And here's the other one conversation we need to have as well. If globally, and Renai, I enjoyed to read the research paper that you published about a year ago, 2 years ago on the inverted triangle. So when we look at global supply chain and we're saying that, global supply chain and we're saying that tier 2s and tier 3s are the biggest contributors, then tier 1s and local OEMs to local value addition. And in South Africa, we have an inversion, and that inversion it was 40% OEMs, 40% tier 1s, and 20% tier 2s and tier 3s. And this was at the time when we were drafting this, we were drafting SAM. When I tried to get the numbers of LVA per segment, the numbers that I came with as current numbers are 52, 38, and 9. Now, one of the few things that makes LVA easy at our factory floors as OEMs has got to do with the fact that APDP and APDP, the structuring of APDP is pro-OEMs to some extent. And so it's easier for OEMs to an extent to be LVAs. And perhaps one other discussion we should have, additional to your research around transformation, is how do we graduate that value addition to tier 2s and tier 3s and build that base of suppliers to be a bigger base. The beauty is that, Andre, if we grow tier 3s, they don't have to go through your process of investment. And so growing that pool and graduating this value addition is an important discourse that we need, a discussion that we need to have. And so that we could then get into that space. But from a transformation point of view, I'll skip over this. The other challenge that we have, and it's perhaps one where our conversations on Fridays and Thursdays this week will gravitate towards with our academic institutions, is the fact that, and perhaps I'm speaking this from being an industrial researcher for as long as I had been, is that the innovation chasm, which is the distance from the people that innovate and design our vehicles to the manufacturing process, remains the biggest challenge with how long it takes. Some of the few things like test centers that are outside the country, we are in discussion with the SABS to open some of their old closed ones so that we bring them close. But a lot of research happens offshore. And so what it means is that you've got institutions locally that are doing research, but not to solve problems for our industry. And so that is why the process are protracted and you need to do certain. And so if there's another conversation that we need to have is, if there's potential to move research closer, and we get some of our institutions doing some of the test work, especially, because that's possible. It's not as beneficiation, like you said, Hoosain. We won't get into that conversation, but that's possible as well. We get that chasm to be closed by bringing it closer. Some of these costs that we speak to today, we can address them. And if we are able to close that chasm and we bring in tier 3's relationships, and we create new pool of them, we'll probably be able to graduate our tier 3's into tier 2's. Now, when I started this conversation, I said, we need to work on a theory of change, and this is the OEM's theory of change. Now, I am willing to take criticism on it, and perhaps being a new entrant into the auto sector, much like you, Mr. CEO, I'm also 2 years in the industry. And so Hoosain and all the esteemed colleagues in the auto sector, there's a phrase that they always use with me whenever I get energetic and overambitious with my assertions and beliefs. They say that if it's simple, we could have done it a long time ago. And so there is a level of naivety in me making this assertion. However, these conversations are the ones that we're having as an industry from an OEM point of view. Thank you.
Renai, Tshetlhe has obviously not heard you. There's no low-hanging fruit. What do you guys reckon? Do we have a little body break? Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm not even going to ask any longer. So it's now 10, what is it? 10:30, smack. 15 minutes? 15 minutes, good? You have your break. Thank you.